It was a small house on a quiet street in Villisca, Iowa. A white, two-story home with a porch. The kind of house you'd see anywhere in the Midwest in 1912. Inside lived the Moore family. Josiah, Sarah, and their 4 children Herman, Catherine, Boyd, and Paul. They were a good family. Respected. They went to church on the night of June 9th. 2 young friends of the children, Lena and Ina Stillinger, were staying over after a church event. 8 people slept in that house. None of them saw the sun rise on June 10th. A neighbor noticed the house was too still the next morning. No kids running out to do chores. No sounds from the kitchen. She called Josiah's brother Ross Moore. He had a key. He opened the door and walked into a nightmare. Every person in the house had been bludgeoned to death with an axe. Their faces were covered with bedclothes. The killer had moved through the house methodically, from the parents' room downstairs to the children's rooms upstairs. He or she or they had taken the time to find a lamp, remove its chimney, and set it at the foot of one bed. They had taken a 2-pound slab of bacon from the icebox and left it on the floor of a downstairs room, wrapped in a dish towel near the axe. They had hung cloths over every mirror and pane of glass in the house. Then they locked the doors from the inside and vanished. The town of Villisca was never the same. The horror of what happened in that house seeped into the ground, into the very identity of the place. But something else happened too. The investigation was a disaster. The crime scene was immediately contaminated. Hundreds of people, maybe more, walked through the house before it was secured. They came to gawk, to whisper, to touch the walls. They were driven by a morbid curiosity that destroyed any chance of finding good evidence. The local sheriff was overwhelmed. State detectives came in, bloodhounds were brought out, but their trail went cold at the river. They had suspects, plenty of them. A powerful state senator with a grudge against Josiah Moore. A traveling preacher who acted strangely and later confessed. A suspected serial killer from a nearby state. A drifter seen in town. But they had no proof. No smoking gun. The investigation spun its wheels for years, turning up nothing but rumors, accusations, and dead ends. The grand juries indicted a few people, but no one was ever convicted. The case went cold, and the questions just hung in the air unanswered for more than a century. And that brings us to the question, a simple, frustrating question. Could a single hair have solved it? Could one tiny piece of evidence, overlooked or trampled underfoot in the chaos of 1912, have given this story an ending? The answer is yes. It's a qualified, heartbreaking yes. A single hair, found in the right place, preserved, and tested with modern technology, could have blown the case wide open. It could have ended the speculation. It could have replaced 100 years of ghost stories with a single, undeniable fact. To understand how, you have to understand the difference between an investigation in 1912 and one today. In 1912, forensic science was in its infancy. Fingerprinting was a new technique, and it wasn't even done correctly at the Villisca crime scene. They dusted for prints, but didn't know how to properly lift or compare them. Blood analysis could only tell them if it was human blood, not whose it was. The idea of collecting microscopic evidence like hair or fibers was almost unheard of. An investigator might have seen a stray hair on a pillowcase, a dark strand against the white linen, and thought nothing of it. He might have brushed it aside, he might have assumed it belonged to one of the victims. He would have had no way of knowing he was discarding the key to the entire mystery. That single hair, in the hands of a modern crime lab, is a potential goldmine. And with hair you can get 2 kinds. First, there's mitochondrial DNA, or mtDNA. You can get this from the shaft of the hair, the part you can see. mtDNA is passed down from a mother to her children. So, your mtDNA is the same as your mother's, your siblings, your grandmother's on your mother's side, and so on. It's not unique to one person like a fingerprint, but it is incredibly useful for exclusion. Let's say they had a suspect, Reverend George Kelly. If they found a hair at the scene and its mtDNA did not match the mtDNA from Kelly's maternal line, they could say with near certainty that the hair wasn't his. He could be excluded. You could do this for every suspect. It's a powerful tool for narrowing down a list. But the real prize is nuclear DNA, or nDNA. This is the DNA that makes you uniquely you. And to get nDNA from a hair, you need the root, the little bulb at the end that was attached to the scalp. If the killer, in his struggle or in a moment of carelessness, left behind a hair with a root attached, that would be the ball game. A single hair with a root contains a complete genetic profile. It's as good as leaving your driver's license at the scene. So let's go back to that blood-soaked house in 1912. But this time, let's imagine one of the first responders is a modern crime scene investigator. She wouldn't let the crowds in. She would tape off the scene. She would put on gloves and a suit. She would walk through the rooms with a powerful flashlight, scanning every surface. And on the pillow next to Sarah Moore, she finds it. A single dark hair that doesn't look like it belongs to any of the fair-haired Moore family members. She carefully picks it up with tweezers and places it in a sterile evidence bag. That one simple act changes everything. Now let's play out the possibilities. Let's see how that one piece of evidence could have unraveled the whole thing by looking at the main suspects. First, there's Frank F. Jones. He was a prominent man in Villisca, a state senator. He and Josiah Moore had been business partners, but they had a bitter falling out. Josiah had left Jones's farm implement company to start his own, and he took the valuable John Deere dealership with him. The rumors swirled that Jones was furious, that he had threatened Moore. There were also whispers that Josiah was having an affair with Jones's daughter-in-law. The motive was there, business, and maybe personal honor. Jones had an alibi for the night of the murders, but the theory was that he didn't do it himself. He hired someone. The prime suspect for the hired gun was a man named William Blackie Mansfield. Mansfield was a rumored killer for hire, a tough guy from Illinois. A private investigator hired by a Burns detective agency built a case that Jones paid Mansfield to do the job. Mansfield was even arrested, so what would our hair tell us? If the DNA from the hair matched Blackie Mansfield, the case is solved. It's over. You have direct physical evidence placing him inside the house. You have the killer. The next step would be to prove the link to Frank Jones. Did Jones pay him? That would be a separate legal battle, but the identity of the man who swung the axe would no longer be a mystery. The town would know who did it. The families would have an answer. Mansfield always maintained his innocence. He even sued for false arrest and won a settlement. A DNA match would have proven his guilt beyond any doubt. But what if the hair didn't match Mansfield? That's just as important. It would essentially clear him. It doesn't prove he wasn't involved. Maybe he hired someone else, but it makes the case against him incredibly weak. And if the hair didn't match Mansfield and it didn't match Frank Jones himself, it would suggest the whole Jones hired a hitman theory, which has been the leading theory for decades, might be completely wrong. That one hair could have saved an innocent man from being labeled a murderer for 100 years and sent investigators in a completely new direction. Next, consider Reverend George Kelly. He was a strange man. A traveling preacher who was in town for the Children's Day services the Moores and Stillingers attended on the night they were killed. He left town early the next morning. Years later, he was questioned and gave a detailed, bizarre confession. He said a voice told him to slay utterly. He described the crime in a way that seemed to have inside knowledge. He was put on trial, but then he recanted his confession, saying he was coerced and mentally exhausted. His first trial ended in a hung jury. His second trial ended in an acquittal. He walked free. Many people still believe Kelly was the killer. He was creepy. He had a history of mental illness and inappropriate behavior around young women. His confession felt real to some. Now, imagine our hair evidence. A lab tests it, and the nuclear DNA is a perfect match for Reverend Kelly. Suddenly, his confession is no longer the ramblings of a disturbed man. It's the truth. The details he knew because he was there. His recantation becomes a desperate lie to save his own skin. With that DNA match, the jury wouldn't have been hung. They would have convicted him. He would have been seen not as a sad, strange man, but as a brutal killer who hid behind a preacher's collar. The town of Villisca would have had its monster, a name and a face to attach to their fear. The mystery would have ended in a courtroom in 1917, but again, what if it wasn't his hair? What if the DNA proved the hair belonged to someone else? That would lend enormous weight to the idea that his confession was false, that he was just a mentally ill man who got caught up in the hysteria and was pressured by police. It would mean the state tried to convict an innocent, albeit disturbed man. The acquittal would feel less like a failure of the justice system and more like a moment where it actually miraculously worked. The hair could have either condemned him or completely exonerated him. Then there is the most chilling possibility of all, Henry Lee Moore. No relation to the victim. He was a serial killer. Just a few months after the Villisca murders, Henry Lee Moore killed his own mother and grandmother with an axe in Columbia, Missouri. The circumstances were eerily similar. The weapon was an axe. The victims were attacked in their beds as they slept. He was convicted of those murders and sentenced to life in prison. Later, investigators started connecting the dots. They looked at other axe murders in the region around the same time. Colorado Springs, Colorado. Monmouth, Illinois. Ellsworth, Kansas. All unsolved, all brutal, all involving an entire family killed in their beds with an axe. The timeline and location suggested a single killer, perhaps moving along the railroad lines. And Henry Lee Moore was a railroad man. Could he have been in Villisca on June 9th, 1912? It's possible. The theory is that he was a transient psychopath who passed through these towns, killed for some unknown reason, and then moved on, leaving a trail of carnage and baffled local police departments. He's what we would now call a serial killer. This is where our single hair becomes the most powerful tool. The police in 1912 had no concept of linking crimes in different states through forensic patterns. They were isolated incidents, but a DNA profile is not isolated. If the hair found in the Moore house matched the DNA of Henry Lee Moore, it wouldn't just solve the Villisca murders. It would potentially solve half a dozen other massacres. It would prove that a single, terrifying predator was responsible for wiping out entire families across the Midwest. It would rewrite a huge chapter of American true crime history. The Villisca murders would no longer be a singular, bizarre local event. They would be the work of one of the nation's earliest known serial killers. The scope of the tragedy would expand, but it would also have an explanation. It wasn't about a business deal or a local feud. It was about a monster who passed through town. There were other suspects too. A man named Andy Sawyer, a drifter who worked for the railroad. He was briefly considered a suspect after he supposedly talked about the crime with a coworker and was found with an axe. His boss turned him in, but the local sheriff was convinced Sawyer was just a talkative vagrant and let him go. A hair could have proven that sheriff right or horribly, tragically wrong. There was also a theory about a man named Sam Moyer, a relative of Josiah's, who was rumored to have made threats. A hair could have put these smaller, less-known theories to bed, or it could have elevated one of them to the absolute truth. But there is another possibility, one that is just as profound. What if the lab tests the hair and the DNA profile comes back and it doesn't match Frank Jones, Blackie Mansfield, George Kelly, Henry Lee Moore, or any other known suspect? What if the profile is run through every criminal database, every genealogical database, and there is no match at all? That would be a different kind of answer. It would tell us that everyone has been wrong for more than a century. All the books, all the documentaries, all the theories debated in late-night internet forums, all of them were chasing ghosts. The killer wasn't the state senator, he wasn't the creepy preacher, he wasn't the known serial killer. He was someone else entirely, a complete unknown, a true phantom who slipped into town, committed an act of unimaginable violence, and slipped away without leaving a name. In a way, that might be the most terrifying answer of all. It would mean the evil that visited Villisca had no local context. It wasn't born of a business dispute or a personal vendetta, it was random. A stranger, the ultimate boogeyman. This result would exonerate every person who ever fell under suspicion. It would clear names that have been tarnished for generations, but it would also deepen the core mystery. We would know who it wasn't, but we would still have no idea who it was. The case would remain unsolved, but the focus of the investigation, even a historical one, would be reset to zero. And of course, there's one final, mundane possibility. The hair could have belonged to one of the victims. It could have been Sarah Moore's hair, transferred onto the pillow during the struggle. Or it could have been Josiah's. Or it could have been a hair from a visitor who was in the house days earlier. If that were the case, the hair would tell us nothing. It would be a forensic dead end. A tantalizing clue that led nowhere. And that, in itself, is a realistic and frustrating part of any investigation. Not every clue pays off. The power of this what-if scenario lies in what it says about truth and time. For a century, the story of the Villisca Axe Murders has been just that, a story. It's been filled with characters, motives, and plot twists. We can choose the version we find most plausible. Do you believe the powerful businessman did it? Or the disturbed preacher? It's a matter of opinion, of weighing circumstantial evidence. A single hair with DNA evidence would change all that. It would pull the story out of the realm of folklore and plant it firmly in the world of fact. It would replace, I think, what we know. That's a profound shift. It offers a kind of peace that speculation never can. For the descendants of the victims, it would provide a definitive answer to a question that has haunted their families for generations. For the town of Villisca, it could finally put the ghosts to rest. The house on the corner would no longer be just a place of mystery, but a place of solved, if tragic, history. The tragedy of the lost evidence is that this answer was probably there. It was likely lying on a pillow, caught in a bedsheet, or stuck to the floor. In the chaos and confusion of that June morning, amidst the screams and the shuffling feet of 100 curious townspeople, the key to solving the entire crime was likely swept away, wiped up, or simply ignored. It was a product of its time. They didn't know what they were losing. They couldn't have imagined a future where a microscopic strand of keratin could speak louder than a confession. So, could a single hair have solved the Villisca Axe murders? Yes. It could have pointed a finger directly at one of the main suspects, confirming a long-held theory. It could have exonerated every known suspect, telling us the killer was a complete stranger. It could have connected the crime to a string of other murders, revealing the work of a serial killer. It had the potential to provide the one thing that has been missing from this case for over 100 years' certainty. Without it, we are left where we have always been, in the dark. In that quiet, blood-stained house, with the mirrors covered and the doors locked from the inside, wondering who did it and why. The truth is lost to time, and all we have is the story, the questions, and the chilling knowledge that the one small thing that could have provided an answer was probably there all along waiting to be found. It's a reminder that sometimes the biggest truths are hidden in the smallest details, and that the greatest mysteries are not born from a lack of clues, but from our inability at the time to understand them. The evidence wasn't lost because it vanished. It was lost because no one knew they were looking at it.